Who's winning in primetime and why? Welcome to the Voice of College Football. Discussion, debate, and analysis like no other on the game we all love each and every day right here at the Voice of College Football. All right, you've liked the series. We appreciate the comments and the positive feedback. Continue to support, share the videos out on social media, and leave your requests down below in the comments section in regards to how you want me to attack college football TV ratings or any other series that you would like to see us take on. We have delivered analysis on all the conferences, all the networks, and now we are going through the various time windows through each day. We've arrived at prime time. Prime time. Let's look at it right here, starting with weeks 0 and 1. A lot of interesting factors here. First and foremost would be that there are more prime time games throughout the week because, figure this out, Tuesday, Wednesday, MAC games. Thursday and Friday, there are primetime games when they're not games, obviously, at noon and 3:30 Eastern time during the week. So there are more games to analyze right here. And it was Ohio State Notre Dame, one of the most watched games in college football in week 1, the number 1 game of the week on ABC at 10.5 million views. Florida State LSU, this is where we provide the context. It was on a Sunday night. It had no competition. So that 3 million viewer win by Ohio State Notre Dame on ABC over Florida State LSU on ABC was even more significant than that. Much more significant because there were other games, of course, on Saturday night. Clemson, Georgia Tech, an ACC game on ESPN, fared extremely well. That was the second highest rated game in the ACC all season. Penn State, Purdue, West Virginia, Pitt went up against each other on Thursday night on Fox and ESPN. And there you see Penn State and Purdue edged out the Mountaineers and the Panthers by about 400,000 viewers. Utah, Florida fared well on ESPN as well. And you see it on down the line. Rare Big Ten conference game to start out the season on FS1. Illinois, Indiana at just under 1 million views. Let's move it on to week 2. And less people watching college football in primetime. The number 1 game was Florida, Kentucky on ESPN, 4.5 million views. It was the 3rd ranked game of the week, all time slots included. USC and Stanford with one of the bigger games in the Pac-12. Not one of the bigger games, one of the more highly viewed games in the Pac-12. Rarely do we see a Pac-12 game get over 3 million views. The highest on the season was USC-UCLA. We will see that later. But this Stanford Cardinal Trojan game on ABC at just under 3 million views. There you see there were 3 top 10 games for the week that were in the primetime window. But again, Louisville-UCF, we've got to take that into context. It was on Friday night, meaning nobody else is playing. This is the game to watch. So that number is inflated at 1.85 million. On to week 3 and a 9 p.m. Eastern time game. So we cut off the primetime window from the late night window at 9:30 Eastern. This one kicked off at 9 Eastern time at Texas A&M with 3.4 million views, just ahead of LSU and Mississippi State. That was actually a game that was played right in front of them at 6 p.m., so not necessarily primetime there, but of course we've got to massage the rules to fit all these games into some kind of window. There we see the Ohio State effect, despite playing a MAC team against 2 pretty good football games that we see above. It was the 5th highest rated game of the week. Ohio State and Toledo, 77-21. Elsewhere down the line, Michigan State, Washington on ABC did not do as well as Ohio State and Toledo. Crazy. Florida State, Louisville, again, Friday night, alone by itself, no competition on ESPN at 2.75. One of the better Friday nights, if not the best Friday night showing we're going to see all season as a top 10 game. When we go to week 4, we see Ohio State blew out Wisconsin. So this number is pretty impressive, again, for the Big Ten and for ABC in primetime, as we see ABC is going to do extremely well in primetime, regardless of what conference they show. But in this particular game, Ohio State raced out to a 4-touchdown lead, and I'm sure a ton of people went to other games. It was still the 2nd highest rated game of the week. Arkansas, Texas A&M at number 2. Oklahoma, Kansas State as the Big 12 chimes in there on Fox. And, of course, we know that the Fox menu is generally the Big 10 and the Big 12. There we see a Friday night game between Virginia and Syracuse. This was one of the top 10 rated games from the ACC all season. But, again, it's because it was on Friday night by itself with 1.8 million views. For the second time in 3 weeks, the Big Ten Network went with regional coverage because they had multiple teams playing out of conference games, but didn't fare nearly as well as they did in primetime 2 weeks earlier when they had over 1 million viewers. This time only 285,000, the 24th ranked game of the window in primetime. We move it on to week 5 and a rare win for the ACC with Clemson and North Carolina State with almost 5 million views. That was the highest rated game for an ACC conference game all season and the second highest rated game of the week. LSU and Auburn on ESPN fared well. There we see again Thursday and Friday night games doing pretty well despite those being group of 5 teams. West Virginia, Texas on FS1, Nebraska, Indiana played on BTN, one of the higher rated games on the Big Ten Network at 1.14 million. Week 6 was the rare CBS night game, the only one of the entire season. Bama Texas A&M ruled the week with 7+ million viewers. It was the number 1 rated game of the week. There you see nothing really else in primetime challenged it, as Notre Dame and BYU on NBC was the 9th highest rated game of the week. Clemson, BC in the top 10 as well. Iowa, Illinois was an important game in the Big Ten Western Division, carried by BTN, but the viewers weren't necessarily there at under 1 million. Nebraska and Rutgers for Big Ten fans were playing at the same time with over 1 million views on FS1. Let's go to Week 7, and the primetime winner here is ABC and the ACC, Clemson and Florida State. And when I mentioned earlier that it was a rare win for the ACC, I meant in terms of overall day. The Big Ten and the SEC win that every week. There was only 1 week where the ACC popped through, and that was actually Clemson and Syracuse at noon. Here's a Clemson-Florida State game on ABC that did okay. Actually, it's not a good number for a primetime window at 3.38 million. Actually, people were all over the place watching games. There wasn't one dominant game in Week 7. USC and Utah, a really good game, of course, on Fox. And that got almost as many viewers as LSU and Florida was right there, and Notre Dame Stanford with the Cardinal pulling off the upset on NBC. Those were all top 10 games, as we see again the group of 5 faring well, with the American Conference taking the lead as always on Thursday and Friday night with Temple and UCF, and with SMU and Navy close to 1 million viewers. Let's move it on to Week 8, and we've got Alabama and Mississippi State as the best primetime game. So the better games, the better matchups, the more popular teams and matchups were earlier in the day. You see the top 4 games of the week were at noon and at 3:30 Eastern time. The top game is never in the late night slot. So 3.6 million people watched Bama and Mississippi State, followed very closely by Minnesota and Penn State at the same time on ABC at 3.54 million. Another top 10 game in TCU and Kansas State. FS1 making an appearance in the top 10. That is fairly rare. Thursday and Friday efforts made by the ACC on ESPN, and also Temple and Tulsa representing the American Conference. We go to Week 9 and a Michigan State game that, despite it being a dull game and all the theatrics after the game that we didn't know about at the time, the pull of the Big Ten in Michigan and ABC put it all together, and you've got 5.58 million people watching the game. It's the 3rd highest rated game of the week. Tennessee, Kentucky was a blowout on ESPN, still did rather well at 4 million views. And there you see everything else under 1 million except for this ESPN game between NC State and Virginia Tech that led into the Tennessee-Kentucky game, 10th highest rated game for Week 9. Bama LSU on ESPN. This is rare for ESPN to win the week in the primetime window, but they did it in blazing colors. Bama and LSU, 7.5 million people watched the game, 2nd highest rated game of the week. There was a Big Ten game, I believe, that did better. It must have been Ohio State, Penn State, or one of the other games that we have featured on the other videos. Clemson Notre Dame was just trampled by this Bama LSU game. And of course, the Bama LSU game was much better. So we don't know how this viewership started, but where it ended was obviously well over 2-to-1 ratio with the SEC game over the Clemson Notre Dame game on NBC. Miami Florida State, actually, that's a horrendous number for ABC. They got no viewers on Miami and Florida State. It was a bad game. Miami's bad, and just nobody showed up to watch that game. Almost as many people watched Michigan and Rutgers on the Big Ten Network as watched Florida State and Miami, as that was an uncommon top 10 finish for the Big Ten Network on that particular weekend of Week 10, Texas-Kansas State, with a good Kansas State team, but they don't draw a ton of viewership. And there you see the rest of the games. Rare appearance for the SEC on ESPN2, as that used to be a common landing spot for the SEC, but not in 2022. Just over 500,000 people watched Auburn and Mississippi State. And now we're starting to see the effects of MACtion on Tuesday and Wednesday. And this is really a good move by the Mid-American Conference, because 300,000 and 400,000 people are not going to watch MAC football against the Big Ten and the SEC and the other conferences on a Saturday afternoon. So there we see 361,000 watching Western Michigan and Bowling Green on E2. And then the previous night, Ohio and Toledo got 278,000 viewers. And we will see even better numbers out of the MAC during the midweek games of Tuesday and Wednesday. Strike one up for the Big 12, Week 11, primetime, Texas TCU. Good football game that went down to the wire. Not an exciting game from an offensive standpoint at 17-10, but 5 million people watched it. It was the second highest rated game of the week. Washington, Oregon, excellent game. Over 3.5 million views. Good showing for the Pac-12 on Fox for the Pac-12. Georgia, Mississippi State, a rout on ESPN, but still, it's Georgia and it's the SEC. They're going to do well. All the rest of the primetime window games did less than 1 million views, highlighted by a Friday night event. East Carolina taking on Cincinnati on ESPN2. Exciting North Carolina Wake Forest game on E2. So there, we need some context. And the context is on Friday night, everybody was watching college football, East Carolina, Cincinnati, as opposed to North Carolina and Wake, even though it had just about 200,000 less viewers, probably a more impressive showing because they had all this competition. Then we see a ton of weeknight games highlighted by Tulsa, Memphis, USC and Colorado playing on FS1 with just over 500,000 viewers, and then a bunch of MAC games line up. And again, it's showing that the MAC, highlighted by this Ball State-Toledo game that got almost 500,000 viewers, is a good showing for MAC football on ESPN. Week 12 in the big upset of South Carolina over Tennessee highlighted the week on ESPN, one of the highest rated games on the network all season at almost 4.9 million viewers, and the third highest rated game of the week. This USC-UCLA game was the highest rated Pac-12 game of the season, 4.53 million. Oklahoma State, we got to take into consideration off year by Oklahoma, worst record since 1998. Oklahoma State had a down year after reaching the Big 12 championship game the year before. So still, the strength of the rivalry pulls in over 3 million views on ABC as the number 7 game of the week. Again, the American Conference shows up well for a group of 5 on Thursday and Friday night with SMU and Tulane at 767,000. And a bad South Florida team taking on Tulsa on ESPN2 still got 500,000 views. And the final weekend of the season, the most impressive showing here is actually USC and Notre Dame. Not the Florida State game, because that was on ESPN on Friday night. By itself, no competition. USC and Notre Dame had competition and basically the same audience at 6.7 million viewers in the third highest rated game of the week, in a week dominated by Ohio State and Michigan at number 1 and Auburn, Alabama at number 2. LSU, Texas A&M upset by the Aggies on ESPN as a top 10 game. There you see Fox with Kansas State. And then let's note, Thanksgiving night, Ole Miss and Mississippi State have been playing on ESPN since, I believe, 1998. There was an NFL game, of course, so this is a pretty good showing with the NFL game, and the NFL dominates TV. 2.2 million watched the Rebels and the Bulldogs in, unfortunately, Mike Leach's final game. Now it's time to put context to the numbers and add it all up in different categories to give you a different perspective on the ratings in 2022 in the prime time window. Disney ruled here. So 12 out of 13 weeks, a Disney network, ABC or ESPN, had the number 1 game. It was just that one time when CBS jumped into the fray with the SEC's Bama Texas A&M game, did they have the number 1 game. Now, when we look at the top 10 games of the week, ESPN, this is where they rarely have the top game or a top 2 or 3 game, but they come in strong with tons of quality throughout the rest of the top 10. And this is also ESPN faring well with the American Conference, airing a lot of games on Thursday and Friday. So 17 games for ESPN in the top 10. ABC had 13. There you see down the list. CBS just had the one appearance, and it was the top game of the week. Fox, 6 top 10 games throughout the 2022 season, as of course Fox shows and showed up favorably in the noon window with primarily Big Ten games. And now let's look at the viewership of these games. So again, ESPN and ESPN2 are showing us a ton of games in the primetime window because if you think about it, you can only show one game at a time. So everybody's showing a game on Saturday night. However, ESPN and ESPN2 are more than doubling that because they're showing games on Thursday and Friday night. That's why ESPN showed 30 games at almost 82 million viewers. Now, ABC's got the best per game showing with 14 games for 64 million viewers. And you see the other statistics. So you see the total audience viewership. And then we see, of course, once we break it down into the number of games that are played, we see how the averages play out. Now, we showed you the number one games and how they were represented by network. Let's show you how they were represented by conference. 13 times the SEC played the number one game, which is pretty impressive since their number one games are typically on CBS at 3:30 Eastern. The Big Ten 5 times. Now, of course, again, that's also impressive considering that the Big Ten is showing its best games at noon, and that's where the Big Ten dominated. Check out our noon video where we broke down the TV ratings for 2022. The ACC, you see there with 5, the Big 12 with 2, and Notre Dame had the number one game taking on Ohio State. Now, if we move on to the top 10 representation by conference, well, there you go. It's the SEC still dominating over the Big Ten. The ACC faring well with some strong games, not necessarily number one games, but strong within the top 10. And the Big 12 as well, as most of those games were on Fox, a few on FS1 as well. The American Conference showed up in the top 10 as well as some other conferences. What networks showed what conferences? Let's look at ABC. They showed a lot of Big Ten in prime time. They showed the Big 12. They showed the ACC. So now let's check out what networks are showing what conferences. First, let's look at ABC, showing a lot of the ACC and the Big Ten in prime time. And this is how many teams showed up on these networks, because if there was a non-conference game, then we would count one for each conference. When we look at ESPN, we see heavy SEC right here, followed by the ACC, and not much from anyone else on ESPN as that contract lines up that they play a lot of SEC games on ESPN in the primetime window. So the SEC, obviously, as you would expect, doing a nice job with this television contract, heavy on CBS at 3:30, then right into the primetime window on ESPN. We check out Fox, and we see heavy dose with the Pac-12. I don't know what else Fox is showing late night on Saturday or in the primetime window that they're not always showing. Maybe they're going with Major League Baseball. I didn't dissect that to a T, but they had less primetime football games than ABC and ESPN did. Certainly, when we look at ESPN2, they're pretty much all over the map. No real concentration there. FS1, it should be predicted, while Fox prioritizes most of the time the Big Ten, then it would slot down that the Big 12 would show up a lot on FS1, and that is the case with the Big Ten at number 2. And then, of course, NBC is showing Notre Dame. The Big Ten Network is showing, voila, the Big Ten. And then finally on ESPNU, not a whole lot of Power 5 here in prime time because they have other options, of course, and other priorities. But 4 times SEC teams showed up on ESPNU. A lot of action, of course, throughout the week on EU. Total views per conference. The SEC wins in prime time, 40+ million views with 13 games played. The Big Ten also played 13 games in primetime with 27 million, just under 27 million. The Big 12's right there at 27 million. Obviously, it has to be taken into consideration. The Big Ten fares better earlier in the day. They put the big matchups on Fox at noon. Therefore, the lesser matchups are here. And then also take into consideration that we're going to show you the Big Ten network factor. So we've done this in the other time slots as well. We show you that the Big 12 edges out the Big Ten when you include the Big Ten network. But when you take out the Big Ten network, which of course doesn't have the distribution of the other networks, well, then the Big Ten rises with almost 3 million views per game at 7 games at over 20 million total. The ACC's right at about 2 million views per game at 24 million on 12 games, and the Pac-12 had lesser opportunities in the primetime window. Obviously, the Pac-12 had a lot of 3:30 games Eastern time, and also, of course, they are the one conference that's playing late at night with some of its top games of the year actually played in the late night window, but the Pac-12 did fairly well with just under 2 million views per game for those 6 opportunities. That's how we size it up for primetime on college football for 2022. Again, your comments down below, anything that we missed, anything that we could have analyzed a little bit better, let us know. And also make your requests. Obviously, we've got to have the feedback and we've got to have the viewership to continue this series. And we've got all sorts of stuff planned here at the Voice of College Football. We're going to continue to cover spring football, all the spring football games with live streams and watch parties. Also, once spring football is done, of course, we got the transfer portal humming. It has already started. And then we've got power rankings headed your way, position rankings, player rankings, all right here at the Voice of College Football.